Let us consider the claim that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, this claim was made by Richard Dawkins, and I suppose the first thing that comes to mind is to say that that's really based upon what intellectually fulfills you. Now, in Richard Dawkins' case, I can most certainly understand why he would say that, and I agree that in his case, he as an atheist is intellectually fulfilled by Darwinism. But what does that mean? Well, let's understand something here. One is that biology is a science, and two, that Darwinian evolution is a philosophy. So that's why it's called a theory, because it's a template. It's a template that is made to fit into biology so as to explain it. So you see, biology is the observation, and then the philosophy behind what's actually going on is Darwinism of whatever sort. So, since it's philosophy, and let me back up and give you an example as to what that means, that it's philosophy. Okay, so as a biologist, you can make the observation that different finches have different beaks. That's a scientific observation, that's biology. Then you plug in the philosophy of evolution, and you conclude that therefore all finches have a common ancestor, which actually is true. It was a finch. But when you go beyond that to conclude philosophically that therefore all birds have a common ancestor, well, that also is true. Some kind of proto-bird, the prototypical kind of bird. But when you go beyond that and you claim that therefore all life on Earth has one common ancestor, now your philosophy not only fails, but it's gone beyond the reaches of science. So for Dawkins and people such as he, to be intellectually satisfied as an atheist by Darwinism means that they can concoct Victorian era tall tales and pass it off as science. Now here's an interesting example. The coelacanth, right? The living fossil. This fish that was thought to have been extinct for some 400 million years. And yet it was found swimming around. It's alive and well. So now, particularly if you watch something like the PBS Nova documentary on the coelacanth, it's fascinating. You could literally take that documentary and edit it into two different documentaries. One would show scientifically that human beings are descended from fish such as the coelacanth, and the other one would prove scientifically that human beings cannot be descended from fish such as the coelacanth. Why? Because in that documentary they both tell you that human beings are descended from coelacanth, and also that the coelacanth have virtually remained unchanged for 400 million years. Now, how is it that a fish that has barely changed in 400 million years gave rise to human beings who go fishing and eat coelacanth with a twist of lime? Oh, well, this is where the Victorian era tall tales come in, the Darwinian stories. You see, you get to tell the story. When you don't have evidence, you just tell a story. So it goes something like this. Well, due to environmental pressures, selection, mutation, what happened is one branch of the coelacanth became human beings, and another branch of the coelacanth remained virtually unchanged for 400 million years. Now, that's something to keep in mind, is when you ask atheists and evolutionists of any kind that sort of a question, when you raise this kind of an issue, always pay attention to the storytelling, because that's all it is. And you can throw in all the fancy sounding, fancy book learning language you want. It's still just a story. When I don't have evidence, I can just tell you a story. Oh, I know what happened. Yeah, that's what happened. Here's my story. Wait a minute. That's a story. That's the philosophical part of Darwinism, is it allows you to philosophize. It allows you to just tell a story and pretend that you're speaking scientifically. And now, noticing this kind of a thing, discerning the actual scientifically verified, reproducibly experimented upon verification versus the story is something very important in that it allows the layman to critique the statements of an expert, okay? So when you encounter an expert in biology and evolution, an expert, highly trained and very intelligent scientist, how can you as a mere layman challenge that knowledge? Okay, you could say it's an argument from authority. Very well, good, that's logic. But they do have the authority. They're more trained than you. They know a lot more than you. They have experience. So how can you possibly critique them? Well, this is how you, with just a little bit of self-training, you can actually read what they have to say or listen to what they have to say and discern the scientific evidence versus the storytelling. And if you try this a few times, you'll get the hang of it right away. You'll actually be able to discern them. And it becomes pretty obvious after a while. What is a scientific statement and what is a philosophic statement? Another example of this Darwinian storytelling is there's a pretty well-known video clip you can find where Richard Dawkins asks an African bishop, a black man, an African bishop, "Are you an ape?" And Richard Dawkins says of himself, "I'm an ape. I'm an African ape. I'm very proud to be an African ape, and so should you be." Now, I don't know what pride has to do with it, or much less to be very proud of thinking of yourself as an ape. Now, some people think it's maybe in bad taste that Richard Dawkins would ask a black African man, "Are you an ape?" But, you got to keep in mind that Richard Dawkins himself is an African. Okay, he was born in Kenya, so I wouldn't make an issue out of that whatsoever. There's plenty of other stuff to get on Richard Dawkins about, and he does have extremely bad taste. But what do you expect from a talking ape? Isn't that funny? Some atheists make fun of Christians for believing in talking snakes and talking donkeys, but they believe in talking apes, namely themselves. And by the way, for that claim that Christians believe in talking snakes and talking donkeys, look at the info section, because I wrote an article about that. So now, the bishop denies being an ape and asks a question that really, it's sort of a bad question to ask. It's like, how come there's still apes around if human beings evolved from apes? Because the evolutionary point of view isn't that there's a direct line with no branches from apes to humans, but that just like in the Darwinian story about the coelacanth. Well, environmental pressures, mutations, selection, and some swamp gas reflected off Venus caused one branch to become and remain apes and one branch to become human beings. Now, of course, that isn't true, but that's the current theory. So you need to be aware of that before you ask that question. If you want to call the bottom line of the question, that's one issue. But just to ask that as if it's a silver bullet, you need to be aware of that. So, Dawkins explains very carefully that we didn't come from apes, but that human beings and apes have and here it comes, a common ancestor. So, and he says that it wasn't an ape, it wasn't a human, it was something else, okay? So what is this common ancestor? Well, it's an unevidenced, unobserved, unproven, cryptozoological, mythological creature. That's a chimera. It's half this, it's half that, it's who knows what. It's something else. It's a common ancestor. You see? Because the theory calls for it, therefore it must be true, right? And I can understand that. The template, the theory calls for it. So Dawkins assumes it must exist. Now, if you're doing philosophy, that's fine. Maybe a philosophically necessary being. But that's not scientific, and it's certainly not biology. Now, there's another interesting video clip of Richard Dawkins being asked about how a scale becomes a feather. And he really has a moment of clarity. He catches himself because he explains that basically, since evolution is blind and goalless, doesn't have a goal in mind, as it has no mind upon which to conceive of a goal. Therefore, a scale isn't undergoing change, saying to itself or others, okay, I'm going to be a feather someday, so I have to undergo these changes. Rather, there's gradual changes, and the key point is that all along the way, when it's a half scale and half feather, and all the minute changes, it always has to have a function and a benefit. All right? And it's at that point of explaining that Dawkins catches himself, and he says that he supposes this is a matter of faith on my part. And that was very honest of him, because he realizes that he has no scientific evidence for this, but he can concoct a story. So he relies on his faith and he builds a story upon it. And this is something that's crucially important, and that is that people take Darwinian evolution, they go beyond the science, they turn to philosophy, and that philosophy becomes their worldview. Okay, this is why when you question evolution, you get emotive reactions, as if you've hit a sore spot. Even if you're attempting to deal with the issue scientifically, you get emotional reactions out of people, because what you're doing is you're touching upon the very core of their entire worldview. They take a theory that is supposed to be about biology, and they have literally turned it into a worldview whereby and through which they view everything and judge everything. This is why, for example, some of them will reject the Bible. Why? Because if it conflicts with Darwinian evolution, it is therefore untrue. This is worldview thinking.